Uh, Good morning to all the colleagues. On behalf of Indian Council of Agricultural Research, I welcome all of you, and especially I welcome on behalf of ICAR, the speaker of today, uh, the very eminent personality, Dr. Krishnamurthy V. Subramanian, who is holding a very key position. And you know how important the chief economic advisor to the government of India is, how his contribution is valuable. So thank you very much, Dr. Subramanian, for accepting our request, for giving the lecture on a very important lecture in a very important lecture series. And that lecture series is to commemorate the 75 years of India's independence. Azadi ka Amrut Mahotsav. So this is one of the activities which we are going to do. We have taken up many other activities to commemorate this 75 years completion of India's independence. So this important task we are doing every week. And till date, we had around 22 lectures. This is 23rd lecture in this series. In the past, we had lectures on many topics, not only on the research, not only on the technologies, but also on the motivation, general topics like the one we have today. In the past, we had the lecture of Sri Ravi Shankarji on how to remove the stress. We had lectures from the World Bank consultants. We had lectures from Padma Bhushan Anil Prakash Joshi about the importance of water conservation. Dr. Suri about who is the member of this national COVID expert team about the third wave of this COVID. We had a lecture of Swami Adrus, who is the Mathadipati from Kaneri Much, and he delivered a very good lecture about the organic farming. And Dr. Rajiv Varsne, who is an eminent scientist from the ICAR. So like that, in that same series, today again, we have a very important lecture. What are the reforms after this COVID? Friends, I know you know very well Dr. Subramanian. I don't need to elaborate his biodata, but still, I will try to do some justice by briefly introducing him. Dr. KB Subramanian, currently Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India, is a leading expert on economic policy, banking and corporate governance, a PhD from Chicago Booth and a top-ranking IIT-IIM alumnus. He authored the path-breaking economic survey that commends ethical wealth creation for a prosperous India. By integrating India's rich economic and spiritual heritage with modern economic ideas, he advocates ethical wealth creation through a marriage of the invisible hand of the market with the hand of trust. Dr. Subramanian has brought several ideas to implement welfare programs effectively. His push for the behavioral economics of nudge is acknowledged for its potential to bring behavioral change in India. His idea of thalinomics, derived from thali, of what a common person pays for a vegetarian or non-vegetarian thali, has been acclaimed as the Indian Big Mac Index, combined with the idea of the Bare Necessities Index to measure the reach of water, sanitation, a healthy environment to the common citizen. These ideas enable robust measurement of the reach of welfare programs across India's large population. The 2019 economic survey, again authored by Dr. Subramanian, had laid out the strategic blueprint for India to become a 5 trillion economy for generating a virtuous cycle where private investment, growth, and consumption feed into each other. In the 2021 economic survey, he advocated counter-cyclical fiscal policy using public capital expenditure to trigger the virtuous cycle following the COVID crisis. Drawing on the ideas advocated in his 3 economic surveys, India's economic policy forward, a self-reliant India is now characterized by sharp focus on economic growth to complement efficient welfare by generating the resources to fund the welfare programs, growth via private sector occupying the commanding heights of the economy, and the virtuous cycle of growth via public investment and structural reforms to enhance both aggregate supply and aggregate demand. He is on leave from the Indian School of Business, where he is a professor of finance, and he has been conferred the Distinguished Alumnus Award by his alma mater, IIT Kanpur. Apart from being the youngest chief economic advisor, he is among the youngest to receive this honor from his alma mater. His research in banking, law and finance, innovation and economic growth and corporate governance has been published in the world's leading journals. So you can just know from this brief CV how rich he is in the field of economics, how valuable his contributions are, and how it is important for our country, for our government, the ideas, the surveys which he has conducted. I request the Secretary, Department of Agriculture Research and Education, and Director General, Indian Council of Agriculture Research, Dr. T. Mahapatraji, to chair this important session. And I will request now Honorable Speaker for today, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, for delivering the lecture with the kind permission of the chair. And if the chair has to say something before the talk.
No, Dr. Agarwal, let's go ahead and let's listen to Honorable Speaker. Eh?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So over to you. The floor is yours. Yeah.
Very good morning, all the eminent dignitaries who are in this virtual dais. Thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me to share my thoughts. I'm really humbled to be here. पहले मैं अपने तरफ से सबको आज़ादी के अमृत महोत्सव पर सबको मैं हार्दिक शुभकामनाएं देना चाहता हूं। ये जो 75वां इंडिपेंडेंस डे जो हुआ, ये हमारे लिए बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है और हम सब आशा करते हैं कि जब भारत 100 साल का होगा तब बहुत समृद्ध और बहुत ही एक ऊंची कोटि पर रहेगा विश्व के सारे देशों में। इस आशा के साथ मैं आप सबको दोबारा हार्दिक शुभकामनाएं कहना चाहता हूं। So what I want to do is to actually share the philosophy that has driven reforms, over the last year and a half during the COVID period. First thing we must all feel proud about is the fact that India has been the only country that has done seminal reforms like this during the COVID period. Every other country has not been, and no other country has been able to do structural reforms, even any structural reform. And on the other hand, India has actually gone ahead and brought in a series of seminal reforms during this period. As many of us who have observed India for a long period generally note that India reforms the best when faced with a crisis. And it was the case in 1991. It has been the case now as well. And I think that's something that all of us as Indians must definitely feel proud about. Just one aspect that I want to actually talk about, in the context of Azadi Ka Amrut Mahotsav, before I talk about the philosophy of reforms. As citizens, all of us have always been very conscious about our entitlements, which is absolutely fine. But I think what is very important to remember is that our responsibility as a citizen and our entitlement as a citizen are actually two sides of the same coin. When everybody is quite conscious about their responsibilities, about their duties, then nobody needs to really have to emphasize their entitlements, because when everybody takes care of their duties, I think the need to emphasize entitlements actually becomes, completely irrelevant. I think this is a spirit that actually is very, very important. It's said in the business world that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think what is true for companies is equally true for nations as well. That culture where, as JFK, John F. Kennedy, exhorted his Americans, think not what the nation can do for you, think what you can do for the nation. I think this spirit is something that all of us must embody. And that's a culture that we must aspire to really emulate. And in this, it is very easy for each one of us to say, oh, look at so many other people who are basically just doing their own bit. So why should I, be the one to actually aspire higher? I think that's where moral leadership, social leadership comes from, actually not necessarily giving that excuse that just because X people behave in a particular way, that gives you the incentive for you to also behave in the same way. When you have X people behaving in a certain way used as a rationale for one more person, you behaving, it becomes X plus 1. And when you keep adding that X plus 1, you end up going to an equilibrium where everybody basically just thinks about their entitlements without thinking about about their duties. But on the other hand, if you choose, say, even if X people emphasize their entitlements, let me be the one that emphasizes my responsibility, my duty, then you go from, instead of going into X plus 1, you go from X to X minus 1. And that is how the accumulation of that actually leads to a culture where all of us think about our duties, and that's the concept of, as they say in Hindi also, बूंद बूंद से सागर भरता है. जब हम एक अपना छोटा सा बूंद इस यज्ञ में एक छोटा सा आहुति जब हम देते हैं, तो उससे that is how you actually go from, instead of going to a Y where everybody just thinks about their entitlements, we can go to a Z where everybody thinks about their responsibilities first and then their entitlements. I think that that is just talking about your entitlements without of your responsibilities is putting the cart before the horse. So this culture is something that we all must emulate. And I think human life is incredibly precious, and I think it is to waste human life just talking about our entitlements without actually doing our duties. And in Vedanta there is this concept of dharma. This concept of dharma, actually there is no English word that is equivalent to that. Duty, even duty does not capture the word dharma. So all of us being given the rich, it's not just about reading in books. Actually it has to issue in action, as C. Rajagopalachari actually in his beautiful introduction to the Bhajagovindam song says that knowledge that does not issue out in action is useless in itself. So this knowledge of dharma, if it does not issue out in our actions, then it is useless in itself, is something that we actually must remember. Dharma has to become part of our daily activities, the way we behave. Each one of us behaves by respecting our dharma. I think the need for all of us to actually emphasize our entitlements actually goes away. And I think that is the culture that all of us must really build, and that starts from personal excellence, personal leadership, and not giving excuses for saying that because X people are behaving in this way, that gives me the right to also behave in the same way. So that is the humble request that all of that I would like to make to all the participants. It is ये बूंद बूंद से वो आहुति दे के वैसे ही तभी ये यज्ञ जो है और एकदम बड़ा होगा, और उससे जो फायदे हैं वो आएंगे एक्चुअली जब भारत 100 साल का बनेगा. So let's all really think about our dharma and follow our duties. Every time when you actually are you get this inclination to emphasize your entitlement, also think about your responsibility. I think, that is what the best dedication would be for the Azadi Ka Amrut Mahotsav. With those thoughts, let me speak briefly about the philosophy behind the reforms that have been done. Think about the vision for India to become, a prosperous economy, really prosperous economy by the time India is 100, 2047, and this vision that we've actually articulated, will help India, over the next 25 years. This is not a vision that is for just 1 year or 2 years. This is a vision that will help, economic development over the next, many decades. So that vision, think about it as a triangle with 3 key vertices, or as a tripod with three key legs. The first leg is about the objectives that we must have. That first leg is the focus on growth and growth alone at the macroeconomic level, combined with efficient welfare at the microeconomic level. I'll explain what I mean by this, but let me just first list out. So that's the first leg of this tripod, or the first vertex of this triangle. The second is about recognizing wealth and wealth creation as a boon and not as a bane, and especially given our socialist era policies that never delivered the tryst with destiny that we were promised. I think that second leg is very important. Today, there's a wonderful piece in the Times of India, op-ed by Dr. Arvind Panagaria, who was the Vice Chairman Niti Aayog, highlighting some of the big mistakes that were made, in this attempt at Fabian socialism, which I encourage all of you to read. But that second leg is actually in the same spirit. I'll expand on that. So thinking about wealth and wealth creation as a boon, and not as a bane, and therefore thinking about actually recognizing the role of private sector and us going back to our DNA. Actually, I'll talk about that. That's the second important leg. Many times it is actually spoken as if trade and markets are a Western idea, as we showed in the 2020 economic survey. No, these are ideas that India gave to the world, not the other way around. And I'll talk about that. That's the second important leg of the tripod. The third one is this virtuous cycle starting from private investment. So these 3 legs have to be equally important for India to actually progress in an inclusive manner, for inclusive growth, so that we become prosperous, and every Indian actually benefits from this. From this. So let me expand on each one of these 3 first. Let me start with the first, which is the objective that we must pursue. The first Nobel laureate in economics, Tinbergen, had this rule. Tinbergen, apart from being an academic, also was a policy maker. He, while he kept doing research, there were phases where he went and worked as a policy maker, came back to academia, did research, and again went back to policy. So, somebody who actually also, had both academic and policy making experiences. He said that whenever you have a policy instrument, one policy instrument should have only one objective that it must serve. If one policy instrument is actually we try to have multiple objectives being served through that, oftentimes they end up coming in conflict, and you end up what you end up with is compromise, not necessarily what is first best, or what we economists call Pareto optimal, where everybody benefits. So one policy instrument, one objective. In that spirit, for the macroeconomy, the objective that must be specified is growth and growth alone. Why do I emphasize this? Because when we get growth, you will find a lot of people saying, "हाँ, growth तो ठीक है, लेकिन inequality का क्या है?" What about growth is fine, but what about inequality? I mean, of course, I must mention that there is a large section that oftentimes always looks at the empty portion of a glass rather than the full portion of the glass. Even if that person is given a glass that is 90% full, they'll still say 10% empty here. So yeah, of course this, but that, of course this, but that. Actually, always look at the negative and what is not there. I mean, leave that aside, because that's a egregiously pessimistic constituent that I rather not worry about. But from an analytical point of view, and some people who are even very balanced actually genuinely do raise this question when we have growth, saying what about inequality? Now here in the 2021 economic survey, this year's economic survey, we wrote a chapter which was titled Growth versus Inequality, Conflict or Convergence, asking this basic question. There are a lot of people who actually read Thomas Piketty's work on capital, and oftentimes forget that Thomas Piketty's work is actually based in the advanced economies, and that just extrapolating what happens in the advanced economies to a country like India based on a reading of Thomas Piketty's work is not something that actually is necessarily the right thing to do. Read that book for sure, but also think about how you want to apply that actually in the Indian context, which is what we did in this chapter in this year's economic survey. First, let's understand what are the two key differences between advanced economies versus emerging economies, because of which in the advanced economies there is this conflict between growth and inequality, while in the Indian context actually there is convergence between growth and inequality. Those two reasons are as follows. Advanced economies will be very, very happy to grow at 3% on average per annum, over this decade or the next decades as well. In fact, continental Europe would be even happy with a 2.5% per annum growth, given their demographics, a very aging population, given the entitlements, and the welfare, so the huge subsidies that they have actually, which create enormous inefficiencies. In my opinion, continental Europe in particular has seen its best days. And so, given that going forward, they would be very, very happy growing at even 2.5% per annum. In contrast, a country like India, even with 7% growth, we would want more. We can grow more. We can grow at 7.5–8% consistently for at least the next 2 decades, if not longer. So that's the first difference, that the rate of growth and growth, as they say, it actually has a compounding impact. And to understand this, there is this there is a story that is mentioned that if you take a chessboard, which has basically 64 squares. If you start by putting 1 grain on the first square, keep doubling the number of grains, maybe grains of wheat or grains of rice. If you start doubling it, by the time you actually reach the 64th square, you will require as much grain as there isn't in all of the world put together. That's the power of compounding, because if you keep doubling, at the 64th square, you will have to put 2 to the power 64 grains, and which actually is far more than any amount of grains that we have in this world. So that's the power of compounding. So when a country grows at 7.5% per annum versus grows only at, let's say, 2.5–3%, the impact of that growth on prosperity is just enormous because of the impact of compounding. So that's the first key difference. The second difference is that, and this is actually, so that the first difference is a positive one. The second difference is something that we have to actually, work on, something which is not positive as yet, which is that absolute levels of poverty, in other words, number of people who are below the absolute level of poverty, is actually still large in India compared to an advanced economy where absolute poverty has gone down significantly. So these two key differences, what they mean, therefore, is that in the context of an advanced economy, because they can't grow that fast, And because they've already addressed absolute poverty, for them, the bigger issue that has become now is actually the difference between the rich, the haves and the have-nots, inequality. In contrast, in India, we can grow at 7.5%, 8%, and in the process really lift a lot of people above the absolute levels of poverty. So the opportunity for us to actually, by focusing on growth, is enormous. And therefore, the first thing we have to do is at the macroeconomic level, enact policies that are focused on growth and growth alone. As I will explain, that actually helps inequality as well. So in this economic survey chapter, we correlated inequality and growth for advanced economies and for India with several socio-economic indicators. And what we found was, while in the advanced economies there is this conflict, an increase in inequality makes several socio-economic indicators worse, even if you have growth. But in the Indian context, actually the relationship is identical, is similar. Both growth and inequality have a similar impact on these socio-economic indicators like crime, like gender equality, health, mental health, all these aspects. So growth actually delivers the maximum happiness. And I just saw a question being put on happiness. So this also addresses that, because happiness comes from many different dimensions. If you're healthy, if you have reasonable amount of money to spend on goods and services that you want, and a few other dimensions, then you actually, and if you have people, your loved ones around you, you're happy. So that's why we focused on these socio-economic indicators. And and growth actually has a similar effect on these socio-economic indicators in the Indian context as inequality. Why? Or because in India, as growth has happened, we've actually lifted large number of individuals above the absolute levels of poverty. And I think the best example is since 1991, the growth that has happened. And last point on this focus on growth that I want to mention is, whenever, maybe next 5 years, 10 years later, if somebody tells you, when we are recording high growth and somebody tells you, what about inequality? Remember the pandemic year. Remember 2020. The year where actually global economy shrunk by about 4.5%, and India had actually 7.3% decline, given the very strong measures that we took to actually control the pandemic. The economic restrictions actually had its impact on the. Now, of course, there has been a V-shaped recovery in the macroeconomy, but several commentators talk about the fact that there has been a K-shaped, when you open the hood and start looking between large firms versus small firms, or individuals who are actually more privileged versus the less privileged. In other words, because of this decline, minus 7.3%, it's the poorer sections that have been impacted far more. And I think this is the best illustration of the fact that when you have decline in growth, it is the poorer sections that are impacted the most. Let's never forget this, that a minus 7.3% actually GDP print did not impact the privileged much at all. It impacted the poorer ones, which the logical conclusion from that is therefore that higher growth is by far the most important for people at the at the lower strata of society in terms of economic strata. And that is something that has been illustrated through the growth rate that has happened since 1991 as well. So the focus on growth at the macroeconomic level. Why? Because that is what generates the resources. It creates jobs in the process, but also creates resources for welfare programs to be done. And welfare programs actually are what are important. A country like India has to invest in, for instance, the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. This budget, this year's budget has actually increased the outlay for Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, urban as well, not just the rural one. Access to bare necessities, there's been a significant improvement, but we need to do far more. The chapter on bare necessities, we showed that compared to 2011-12, the 2017-18, there's been huge improvement, especially for the less privileged sections. But we still have more work to do there. Or, for instance, the the programs like the PM Awas Yojana, which have actually helped in creating good places to stay for the less privileged. So these welfare programs we have to do. If we have to do the welfare programs, then growth is very important, because it's growth that generates the tax revenues to be able to do these welfare programs. Over the last 7 years, now, through the use of Jan Trinity, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, Mobile, this government has actually demonstrated that, that India can do efficient welfare without actually, without too much inclusion and exclusion errors, without that much corruption, in the welfare programs. India can do efficient welfare using the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, Mobile. Aadhaar, of course, was created by the previous government, and which it deserves enormous credit for. Jan Dhan was an initiative that was actually done by this government. The mobile, increase, of course, has happened actually because of the telecom revolution that started under Prime Minister Vajpayee ji. So the combination of these three, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, Mobile, the Jan Trinity, has really enabled efficient welfare. Now, this is important. Efficient welfare is important because that's what is the right way to go about reducing inequality in society. Because welfare programs, when they are well directed towards those that are actually at the lower strata of society in terms of income strata, that helps these less privileged ones by putting money in their hand. They go and consume as well, but at the same time reduces their the difference in the earnings and wealth compared to the haves. The have-nots, actually welfare is important. So the combination of focus on growth at the macroeconomic level, growth and growth alone, together with efficient welfare through Jan Trinity, through more technology, and well-directed programs, is what India has to continue focusing on for the next decade or a couple of decades, so that we actually lift the per capita GDP significantly, to middle income levels. That's the first tripod. The second one, as I mentioned, is about the role of private sector. Given the socialist past that we've had, and which, by the way, socialism, was an idea that was never actually India's idea. It was imported from the West. Both communism and socialism are ideas that have been imported from the West. So it was never an idea that India had. In fact, the idea of markets, trade, these are the ideas that India actually taught the rest of the world. So if you go and read the 2019-20 economic survey, the first chart in that survey is based on research by Angus Maddison, research that he published in a book published by the Oxford University Press, where he shows the contribution to world GDP from 1 AD till 2000 AD. So over the last 2000 years, what has been the contribution to world GDP, over 2000 years. And what is the most important thing that we can take away, where actually, and which has ramifications for, how India should be thinking about economic development, that up until 1750 AD, which is 3/4 of known economic history, 3/4 of the last 2 millennia, up until 1750 AD, India accounted for more than 1/3 the world's GDP. Just imagine how, what this is, what this fact suggests. India accounted for more than 1/3 of world's GDP up until 1750 AD. In fact, 1750 was the time when actually the period of imperialism began, which actually led to our decline. In fact, I've spoken elsewhere as well. When I gave the Netaji Subhash lecture on Victory Divas, Moirang Divas, in the month of May, I actually mentioned as well that the reason we actually became so poor was because the imperialist powers, really undermined markets, undermined the invisible hand of markets, and that's what led to our penury. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into that. But Up until 1750 AD, India's prosperity came because of the, of respecting the invisible hand of markets, enabling trade. While we did not use the jargon that Adam Smith coined, the invisible hand of markets, but in spirit, that is exactly what we were doing. If you go and read the economic survey, we actually quote from Tirukkural, which is actually a treatise written, by Saint Tiruvalluvar in my native language, Tamil, in about 3,500 years back. Or if you go and read, for instance, Kautilya's Arthashastra, which was written about 2,000 years back. When you look at around that time, and maybe Kautilya's Arthashastra timing, I may not be getting it absolutely correct, but it's there in the, the timing is mentioned in the economic survey. So these are the kind of, literature that we inherit as Indians. And what do these pieces of literature talk about? They talk about actually trade as really important. Kautilya, in fact, he basically urges the king that it is your duty to actually remove all restrictions for economic activity. Now, that is basically what today's ease of doing business rankings are, really what the World Bank recommends. And this is something that Kautilya talks about. Actually, he urges the king, and by the way, Arthashastra, as you know, Earth is basically one of the 4 noble pursuits that is recommended in Vedanta: Dharma, Earth, Kam, Moksha. Earth is basically that one of the noble pursuits. And I already spoke about Dharma in the, in doing your Dharma, in my early part of my comment. But Arthashastra, so it is basically a treatise on wealth creation. That is what, Kautilya's Arthashastra is. And he talks about actually the importance of trade, importance of private sector, in actually enabling prosperity. Because think about it, when when people like us in our generation, when we think about the superpower, the economic superpower, we always think United States. And how long has the United States been the economic superpower? For about 50 years, half a century. And what has been its contribution to world's GDP during this period of 50 years? On average, about 28%. During the period where India accounted for more than 33% of world's GDP, on average, India's contribution to world GDP was close to 40%. So just compare this for 17 and a half centuries versus half a century. About 28% of close to that thereabout for the US for half a century versus close to 40% for 17 and a half centuries. So a dominance that was actually 35 times longer than the superpower that we know today, and a contribution to world's GDP that was about 1.5 times that what we've seen with the United States. That's the kind of dominance we had. The reason I'm pointing out is not to basically just marvel at this, but to ask, what is it that led to such dominance? We have to learn from history, saying what were the good things that were done that actually led to this kind of prosperity. And when you go and read the scriptures in native language, you find that it is indeed the invisible hand of markets, private sector, worship for the private sector, enabling of the private sector, that led to this kind of prosperity, together with an emphasis on dharma, ethics, that's why the marriage of the invisible hand of markets with the hand of ethics, that's what delivered this kind of prosperity. And that is why I started out by emphasizing the need for every individual to think about his or her dharma and following that dharma. That is what India's DNA has been about. And also think about, those of us in the north. Actually, I was born and brought up in Madhya Pradesh, and so I understand this, and identify with a lot of practices that that are used in North India. If we have an altar at home, if we basically have a puja ghar, for instance, there we write Shubh Labh. We write Shubh Labh. Do we go and write there Shubh and Hani? We don't. In our culture, Labh has something been that it has never been looked at as in a dirty way. Profiteering is bad, but profit was never bad. Shubh Labh, we don't go and write Shubh and Hani, neither do we write Ashubh and Labh. We write Shubh Labh. That is what is our DNA. And the imported ideas of communism and socialism, in fact, actually took India away from its DNA. What we have now done, what we are now doing is returning back to our DNA, which is basically respecting the private sector, thinking about recognizing the efficiencies and the incentives, two key things in economic policy making, the impact of incentives and the impact of information, and thereby enabling the private sector. So when we think about the privatization policy that this government is pursuing, the enterprise policy focused on the private sector, when we think about all the reforms, these are basically India returning back to its DNA. Let's be absolutely clear about that. In fact, moving away from these imported ideas of communism and socialism that were basically never Indian, Indian thoughts. And that's something which every Indian citizen must recognize. So that's a second key focus, which is focusing on wealth and wealth creation as a boon, not as a bane, and remembering that is what has been our DNA, which is what made us so prosperous in the first place. The third is actually the virtuous cycle, starting from private investment. This is when we sat down to write the 2018-19 survey, what we wanted to lay out was a strategic blueprint for India to become a $5 trillion economy first, and then a $10 trillion economy as well. And there, in order to do that, what we did was we went and studied all those countries over the last 1 century that have grown at least 5% plus in real terms, but not just for 1 or 2 years, for an entire decade. So at least a decade of 5% plus growth, over the last 1 century. We went and studied these countries, and what did we find? We found that every such country that grew at 5% plus in real terms for at least a decade grew on the basis of corporate investment, of private investment. That is the investment by the private sector, and that is what basically led us to coin this term virtuous cycle, starting from private investment. Well, how does this virtuous cycle come? When private investment happens, that leads to improvement in efficiency. I think there can't be a better example to illustrate. If I take this phone, this iPhone of mine, this is an investment that I have made. This is an investment that each one of you has made. All of you have, I'm sure, have smartphones as well. This has made you more productive. Why? Because you actually can do, you can WhatsApp, you actually have all the numbers here. You can use, reminders, you can actually have messages. So everything, you are able to do far more now using this phone, in far less time. And that is what productivity is all about. This is a good example of how investment enhances productivity. The same thing, what applies at individual levels, applies at, across for the economy as well. So investment enhances productivity. When productivity goes up at the macroeconomic level, wages go up. And investment also creates jobs. Now, this may be counterintuitive to many of you, but do remember, and the best example is take, for instance, what happened in the fourth quarter, of last year, the financial year that we finished, where because of the emphasis on capital expenditure by the government, construction sector grew by almost 15%. And construction sector in the Indian context is one that accounts for the most jobs in the informal sector, because especially our urban poor migrant labor works in construction sites. So when construction sector grows, jobs that are created for the informal sector are huge. At the same time, let's also look at the evidence. So if you look at a Swiggy today, if you order food through Swiggy or a Zomato, for instance, that person who comes to deliver this food, absent Swiggy, absent Zomato, that person or those Amazon delivery boys, none of them would have gotten those jobs that they have, but for the investment by Amazon, Swiggy, or Zomato, etc. So again, it is investment actually that has led to job creation. So this notion that prevails that investment actually substitutes jobs is actually incorrect. It comes from an incomplete look at this, at the economy. And I'll give you one more example to illustrate this very well. Take the tellers that used to be there. I think some of the older people here must have gone to banks actually to withdraw cash and would have gone to a teller who would have actually been sitting across the counter giving them cash, or if you wanted to deposit money as well, you would fill in a deposit slip and then basically go to the teller and he would help you deposit that money. This is what used to happen in the late 80s and 90s as well. The ATM machines came and replaced that teller's job. So when you just look at it in that way, you'll say, look, this is an example of how, teller, basically the ATM machines coming in took away the job of a teller. That is the example that people will give you, say, look, investment actually takes away jobs. But that is a partial picture. What is the complete picture? The complete picture is when you look at those that worked on developing the idea of ATM machines, those that work on producing these ATM machines, those that actually have to bring in cash every day or so, deposit money into these ATM machines, those security guards that have to sit at the kiosk to actually guard that ATM machine. When you put all this together, when you look across the entire supply chain, not just look at one portion of the supply chain, which is basically the activity of putting cash and withdrawing it, but the entire supply chain, you'll start seeing that capital and labor are actually at the macroeconomic level, not substitutes, they've actually been complements. If it were the case that, that capital substitutes for labor, the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have created the number of jobs that it did create. All the advanced economies created a huge middle class. Through the Industrial Revolution, only because the capital investments that happened as part of the Industrial Revolution created so many organized sector jobs, and that's what led to the creation of a huge middle class. So I think this is again an incomplete incomplete picture, oftentimes also put across by vested interests who do not want actually some of these, as some of the progress to happen, maybe. And so it is important to actually understand that investment first enhances productivity, investment also leads to job creation. And both of these put money in the hands of people. When you have an organized sector job, when your wages go up, you do basically use that to consume more goods or services. That increases demand in the economy. And these are the first round effects. Now, when demand increases in the economy as a result of investment, then firms see that, okay, demand is increasing, I need to produce more goods and services in order to cater to the increasing demand. They invest even more. That's how this feedback loop works. Higher investment leads to more productivity gains, job creation in the organized sector and unorganized sector. That puts money in the hands of people, which leads to more consumption. Anticipating more consumption, people, firms invest even more, and that's how this virtuous cycle moves faster and faster. This has happened in the United States after the World War, the New Deal under President Roosevelt. If you look at Europe after the Second World War, under the Marshall Plan, this was a pattern of growth that happened. If you look at the East Asian economies that grew since the 1970s, same pattern. If you look at China, that has grown after the 1970s, same pattern actually, which is driven through private investment. Even India, after, in the 2000s, when we grew at high rates, actually we grew on the basis of private investment, reaching close to 40%. So these are the three key legs that are really critical for India's economic development. And the reforms that have happened, whether it's the labor market reform, the agriculture reforms, and which, by the way, are extremely critical, for especially for small and marginal farmers. I'm sure here your professors here understand this far better than I do, and so I don't want to actually belabor the point on the farm bills. But clearly, from an economic perspective, farm bills are really more, very, very important for helping the small and marginal farmer. After all, it's a very simple idea that when you have more options, when you have more options as a seller or a buyer, you end up getting more value in the relationship. Those of you who have gone and, let's say, if you go to a Sarojini Nagar here to shop, or maybe go to a fashion street, as a buyer, if you have the option to go and buy from someone else, that person, you say, suppose you're buying a shirt and that person says ki saab aap 500 rupees de do, then you can say nahi 500 rupees bahut zyada hai, main kisi aur se le leta hu. he'll reduce it to basically bring it, theek hai, 400 rupees de dijiye aur khareed lijiye. That is what the option, the fact that seller knows you have another option. Same way, if the small and marginal farmer, when he goes to the APMC and the Arhatiya there knows that if he does not give that small and marginal farmer the correct price, then he can go and sell it to someone else. Actually, that is what increases the value that the small and marginal farmer gets. This has been seen in India across the board, across sectors, wherever there has been greater competition, for the buyers or the, or sellers, that has always been, positive. And that is the way we have to see this. So the reforms on the farm bills, labor reforms, enterprise policy focus on the private sector, the, export PLI schemes, the opening up of defense production, cryptography, so many of these reforms that have been done over the last 1.5 years, all of them follow from these three, these three legs of the philosophy for India's development. So that is what actually will lead to prosperity. And we, at the Ministry of Finance, my office, in my office, we've done estimations that as a result of these reforms, and the push on the capital expenditure side, it's quite likely that India's investment rate, which we macroeconomists measure using the ratio of gross fixed capital formation to GDP, will touch close to 40%, and productivity will improve as well. As a result, FY23, we expect growth to be between 6.5% to 7%, and then accelerate thereafter, to 7.5%, close to 8% for this decade. And this growth will be inclusive as well because of the emphasis on manufacturing and jobs in the manufacturing sector, the reforms that we've done, whether it's labor reforms or the, the changes in the farm bills, etc., which will really help. So overall, I think, let me end on this optimistic note that if we stay true to this economic vision, recognize what is actually, what has been our DNA and stick to our DNA, the next 25 years, by the time India becomes, India becomes 100, India is likely to contribute more than 10% of world's GDP. And that is going to be my last observation. When India became independent, India accounted for about 3% of world's GDP. So that's what the 200 years of imperialist, occupation did, which is brought it down from about more than 33% to 3% in just 200 years. And then another 50 years of Fabian socialism, what did that do? In 1947, India accounted for 3% of world's GDP. By 1987, that is 40 years later, India was accounting for just 1% of world's GDP. That's what those failed policies, socialism and communism, delivered for us. But since then, when liberalization happened, again, now if you go 2017, which is basically 70 years after independence, India has again started accounting for more than close to 3.5% to 4% of world's GDP now. And the projection is, given the growth rates that we anticipate in this decade, and going forward, by the time India is 100, it's likely that India will account for more than 10% of world's GDP and will be a very, very important, and an economic power that will have to be reckoned with in the Committee of Nations. Thank you very much for your patient listening. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for this excellent lecture, Dr. Subramanian. It was full of information, and I think you have touched all the dimensions. I think it was a very informative lecture, especially for a person like me who are non-economist. We could understand. You have made so clear the things, how we can, how the growth can be controlled, how the investment creates jobs, especially the concept which you have given, this how this jam this the Aadhaar mobile, and have really given us the base for the growth, V-shape, K-shape, and many more things. But there are many questions which have been raised, and people are curious to know many things from you. And I'll take some important questions also, only if you just allow for this. The first question is, are we really concerned about happiness index or GDP?
Yeah, let me, I alluded to this briefly. I saw that question pop up when I was speaking, so I just briefly alluded to it. But let me give you a more detailed answer. So there's research now that's been done. This is, this is for the United States, but I think this research we can extrapolate, and therefore I'm using that research to actually tell you the following. So, in the United States, their per capita GDP is about $30,000. I mean, I'm just taking a sort of a round number. What is seen is that when the income of people across states in the United States, US has 50 states. So when they look at the increase in the per capita income or a household's income, till the time it reaches about $65,000-$70,000, which is about twice the per capita GDP. So till it reaches till that level, an increase in income, even a $1 increase in income actually has an impact on happiness. So, up until that point, there is actually a linear relationship. Increase in income actually has an impact on happiness. But once income crosses $65,000-$70,000, it is just flat. So in other words, if you plot, the income of a household on the x-axis, you plot happiness on the y-axis, up until this threshold of around $65,000-$70,000, which is twice the per capita GDP, the happiness increases. But after that, it actually just stays flat. And I think this is something that most of us here, I'm sure, will be able to identify with, that money is necessary, but not sufficient for happiness. I think this is something that all of us will be able to relate with. Those of us who actually had been privileged to earn well, and I say that from personal experience, I can tell you that money is something that is necessary, but not sufficient. And I'm sure if you go and read, some of the rich heritage, and go and read Vedanta, happiness is what comes from within. Despite being very, very rich, it's not as if the really rich people are happy. Let me take the example of someone like this person whom India is trying to extradite back, Vijay Mallya. Some of us may think that, oh, he's really happy because of the parties that he used to throw. Those are all actually extraneous, the kind of tashanbaji that you do to actually show that you're happy. But if you are actually, when you're going down, when you are in your moments alone, if you're so worried about actually, maybe tomorrow I might be extradited to India, in which case, and then I'll be put behind bars, or if that stress remains with you all the time, such a person who's so stressful cannot be happy. And I think there are so many examples like that, which actually clearly illustrate that money is something that is necessary but not sufficient for happiness. I think one of the principles that I tell my students when I teach this class, on the last day, in my last 15 minutes, I just share some experiences and I give them 3 principles out of it to live their life well. The first principle I tell them is, if your only objective in life is to be rich, it shows an extreme poverty of ambition. Let me say it one more time. If your only objective in life is to be rich, it shows an extreme poverty of ambition, because there is a lot more to life, to human life, than just being rich. For instance, contributing to society, contributing to others' happiness, the kind of happiness that you get from contributing to someone else's happiness, no amount of money can buy you that. I can tell you from experience that when you contribute to someone else's happiness, or you actually do something that is beyond your just I, me, myself existence, the kind of happiness that you get is just unparalleled. Money can never deliver that kind of happiness. So this tells you that there are so many dimensions to happiness, At low levels of income, money makes a big difference. So for those who are actually at the, let's say, bottom 20, 30% of population, that there is basically, it is something that money increases happiness. But beyond a certain level, you have to basically find your way of being contented. For instance, I actually can tell you, having studied at the University of Chicago, University of Chicago has more Nobel laureates than all other countries put together. And so, and I have had the good fortune of being taught by so many Nobel laureates. So, I remember this first class in economics that was taught by this Nobel laureate in economics, Gary Becker, who was a 1992 Nobel laureate. He would talk about Milton Friedman in such a positive light. Milton Friedman was, Gary Becker's teacher. And he would basically use this expression that Milton Friedman was the Nobel laureate among Nobel laureates. Now, many of us would be very happy being a Nobel laureate, right? For us, actually, would be, and you have a Nobel laureate who's looking up to another Nobel laureate, saying, I would be that Milton Friedman is a Nobel laureate among Nobel laureates. And I can tell you from personal experience, many of my cousins, for instance, would be very happy being me. And maybe I would want to be some, that's not the way I think now, but people like me might want to actually be a Nobel laureate. The point I'm trying to say is that at every level, if you want to get depressed, you can always keep looking up and say, hey, why am I not as well off as that person, and become depressed? Or you can actually look at people who are worse than you and feel really grateful for the fact that I have, in this life, I have gotten so much more than them. It is about basically the mindset that you bring to happiness. And I think this is something that I actually wanted to share based on personal experience. This is not theory that I'm telling you. This is just based on personal experience that I wanted to share on happiness itself. It is driven to some extent by economic factors, but not by economic factors alone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will take one or two more questions because of the paucity of time. What are the indicators or the parameters adopted in terms of growth which create happiness? How our emerging economy can excel in Indian economy over 7 to 8% to a higher level or significantly higher?
But I've taken the second question. That's exactly what my talk was on. Investment, productivity. So I think I don't want to belabor that point again. And on happiness, my answer was that. So let's take questions that actually are not repeats of what has already been spoken.
Now there is a question by Dr. Ashok. Percent of growth of advanced countries and developing countries is not comparable, as they grow from a very high absolute GDP, filling all bare necessities before, so inequality is not a big issue. But for us, inequality is really an issue for which inclusive growth is very essential. May conflict with the Timbergen.
So my simple answer to to Ashok would be to please go and read that chapter in the economic survey very carefully. I'm sure those of us who are PhDs would acknowledge that we are taught all this to basically be able to control for various different factors. I completely agree with that point. But that chapter takes into account the point that you're talking about. We're not being flaky in saying that inequality does not matter. Inequality does matter, but the way to reduce inequality, that is, in the Indian context, is growth that actually delivers. Please go and read that chapter carefully, and I'll be happy to maybe send me an email if you still don't, don't understand.
Thank you. I take the question connected with the agriculture by Dr. Tanmay Kumar. How investment of private sector can improve the job opportunity in agriculture? Which sector private companies should invest in agriculture? Please give some idea.
Very good. I think this is a nice question. So, see, let me use the example of the Essential Commodities Act, 1955. The Essential Commodities Act, 1955, was passed in 1955, as the Act's year itself suggests. But at a time when the Indian economy used to suffer from severe shortages, those of you who watch Bollywood movies, the movies of the 1970s, 80s, etc., typically would have someone, like Jeevan or Pran, being a retailer that is hoarding, hoards food grains to actually sell at a higher price. And you would see that, then Amitabh Bachchan or Dharmendra actually would go and beat that guy up, because that person who hoarded food grains was that villain. And that was, of course, a reflection of the society that we had in the 1950s, where, 50s and 60s, where food shortage was a problem. In fact, Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri ji, whom I have enormous respect for as a person of such, such exalted virtues, actually came back once and, told his family that we will not have dinner tonight. And that was the milieu there then. But today we actually have burgeoning food stocks, now you may be wondering, why am I actually talking about this in the context of investment? Understanding this context is very important for what I'm going to say. The Essential Commodities Act, what it did was, it actually, because it was passed during a period of shortages, equates all storage to hoarding. Any storage is equated to hoarding. And why is this wrong? Because unlike, for instance, in other cases, agriculture is one area of activity where demand is constant across the year, but supply is seasonal. Let's take onions, for instance. All of us in our food, we need onions all through the year. It's not as if we will eat onions in monsoon, but will not eat onions in winter. No, we need onions all through the year. So demand, and demand is basically by households like us collectively, asking for onions. But onions it's not produced all through the year. So if you have to cater to demand that is all through the year, when supply is seasonal, you have to store that commodity. And yet, what did we do? We basically, in the Essential Commodities Act, we said every activity of storage is hoarding. As a result, what happened? There was no investment created in the private investment in storage infrastructure. If you go and look at the advanced economies, there is so much storage infrastructure that has been created, by the private sector. In India, storage infrastructure is conspicuous by its absence. And that's, having lived for 10 years in the United States and contrasting what you see in the advanced economies to a country like India, I actually am so, taken aback by the fact that there is absolutely no investment on storage infrastructure. Why? Because the law was such that said that any storage is basically hoarding and you'll be put behind bars. And so no investment happened, on storage at all. And as a result, what happens actually, because we don't have private storage, in any year, if our onion crop is actually 10% lower, onion prices go up a lot, because we just haven't created that storage infrastructure. If we had created that storage infrastructure, you would have some people who would store, and when basically in those months where supply is a little less, they will actually bring out what they've stored, and that's what we actually haven't done. So this tells you how our regulations, excessive regulation of the agriculture sector has actually led to such poor investment by the private sector. Private sector includes individuals, actually those small farmers, medium farmers, large farmers, etc. They've not been able to. But now with the farm bills, as part of the farm bills, reforming the Essential Commodities Act is one of the key parts of the farm bill as well. Now, when you don't treat somebody who's basically stores as a hoarder and put him behind bars, you will have investment going up in storage infrastructure, which is really critical for for prices to actually not be so volatile, because when supply goes down, that is when some of the stored supply comes into the market, and that will actually stabilize prices. So like that, investment on technology, for instance, agricultural productivity in India over the last 70, 75 years has been completely stagnant. There has been no increase in productivity at all. And, and institutions like yours actually need to do research on this to enhance productivity. And now the opportunity is there with the kind of reforms that we brought in through the farm bills. Research can happen actually on how to enhance productivity. Investments can go up so that both investments and productivity increases happen in agriculture. It is my clear, we are actually evidence-driven view that the kind of legislation and the regulatory environment that we had in this country in agriculture, that has been the biggest inhibitor of investment and productivity. Now that actually has been, is being taken care of, hopefully institutions like yours would actually invest in coming up with ways for increasing investment and productivity. And that is, what basically would be the biggest national service that, as part of Azadi Ka Mahotsav. I mean, events like these are important, but your dharma is to actually come up with innovations, with basically doing research to help in agriculture so that investment goes up and productivity goes up. That is your dharma.
Thank you very much. Now, just for information, today we have a very learned audience also. The vice chancellors of agriculture universities, our senior officers from Indian Council of Agriculture Research, our all senior directors of ICAR institutes, and a large number of audience through this platform. They connected, it was around 325 participants. And there is another platform through which without video, thousands of persons they are connected. That is ICAR 75 lecture series.babcom.events.com. So thank you very much from my side. I will invite now our Honorable Secretary DARE and DG ICAR, Dr. Trilochan Mahapatraji, to summarize the talk and give the chairman's remark. Dr. Mahapatra, sir, please.
Thank you very much. I don't think I need to really go into detailed summary of what has been presented. So at the outset, let me congratulate Dr. Subramanian for an excellent talk. So we all enjoyed your talk, Dr. Subramanian. And it was simply so educative and full of ideas. And more importantly, you are very young and the youngest economic advisor of Government of India. But you are rooted in so much in Indian philosophy. That's what was reflected in what you spoke about. And आपका हिंदी में बहुत अच्छा दखल है. हम तो सोच रहे थे आपको हिंदी ज्यादा पता नहीं होगा, लेकिन आपके बैकग्राउंड और शायद IIT कानपुर के रहा हो या जो भी हो, आपके शायद दिल्ली में रहे हैं या कहीं नॉर्थ इंडिया में, तो आपकी हिंदी हमसे भी अच्छा है. हमें भी उतना हिंदी मालूम नहीं है, और यद्यपि हम 30-35 साल दिल्ली में रहे हैं. सो बहुत अच्छा लगा आपके ये लेक्चर सुनकर. 2-4 बातें मैं थोड़ा सा दोहरा दूंगा, क्योंकि हमारे जो ऑडियंस 300 से ज्यादा है, उनके I think to emphasize what you said. So, can you please all put off so that you are able to listen? I think what you said in the beginning is very, very important for every one of us, every Indian. Entitlement versus responsibility as a citizen. I think more and more awareness needs to be created on this particular fact for everyone to realize that we have a big responsibility, and as a citizen, and before we talk about more of entitlement, and that's what you cited John F. Kennedy's statement, that of course we have to bother about and think about what we can do for the country, rather than bothering too much about what the country or nation can do for me. I think that's a profound statement which you have brought before us in this Azadi Ka Amrut Mahotsav. I think that's the reason why we have planned this lecture series, and a diverse background of people, and you are being an economist and also a technologist from IIT, IIM, and all that background. I think you have so diverse kind of, your thoughts. That's something which is mesmerizing. So हिंदी हो अंग्रेजी हो, so आपके expressions और जो पहला third था कि entitlement versus responsibility and how one should really behave as a citizen, that's something which is very, very important. And I think everybody should take note and then, think of our own behavior. I think that's very important. And अगर 10-20 लोगों से परिवर्तन शुरू होता है तो it just spreads. So I believe that's the important message which you said. The second is that what you said is in terms of the knowledge, in terms of what we should be doing as an individual. And you went to Vedanta and then talked about Dharma. And the way, of course, there is no equivalent term in English, but the way Dharma has been defined for India based on Vedantic philosophy, that, the very principles of our very existence, the being and becoming, is actually Dharma. So it's not a kind of sectarian principle, and that's what has been defined. So in fact, very often, this philosophy of ours is not really understood, but it's lost in the gross concept of Hinduism. And that ism has created more problems. While the Indian philosophy of Dharma talks about every individual of its own existence and growth. So janatmanang tatha amnesang जीवनंग वर्धनंग चापी धर्म. सो जो अपना जिंदगी बचना बढ़ना और दूसरे को बचना बढ़ना, इस सारे को लेके धर्म. तो मेरा कहने का यह है कि जो आप वेदांत से धर्म को उठा के लाए हैं और उसको जो इक्वालिटी और इक्विटी और ग्रोथ एंड इन्वेस्टमेंट एंड डेवलपमेंट के साथ जो जुड़े हैं, दैट बहुत अनोखा रहा. तो बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद. And this was something which was I individually personally actually thoroughly enjoyed this concept of personal entitlement and then responsibility with our own dharma, and of course dharma as a group and for the individual. So व्यक्ति जीवन का धर्म है, दाम्पत्य जीवन का धर्म है, पारिवारिक जीवन का धर्म है, सामाजिक जीवन का धर्म है और राष्ट्र जीवन का धर्म है. तो पंच महाजीवन है, इसमें सारे में अपना अपना धर्म है. वो धर्म निभाते निभाते वो जिंदगी गुजरता है. और ये समझना चाहिए जो दुनिया अभी दूसरे ईजिन में घुसा हुआ है. सो आई बिलीव योर कंसेप्ट इन दिस पर्टिकुलर एरिया इज रियली प्रोफाउंड एंड आई रियली अप्रिशिएट. एंड द काइंड ऑफ reforms that you talked about, and then the tripod of growth that you talked about, the three vertices. And finally, you covered the whole aspect of kind of growth, investment, and then subsequently India's future as an economic giant. And these are all so well connected, well knit with each other. There's something which is, I'm not an economist, but at least I could get a big sense of what you actually placed before us. Certainly, the focus on growth, as you said, has to be there. Without growth, we can't just move forward. And certainly, without the welfare of the citizens, growth would not be of any meaning. But as growth happens, as you rightly explained during, while answering the question, as growth happens, certainly the welfare also happens, and it automatically takes care. And I think that's a very big message that you have given. So we have to focus on growth. And in that context, what you said is very, very important. How India was contributing to the global economy, in terms of, say, 33% of the global GDP by 1750. And I think that's a big statement. We didn't know. I mean, I didn't know personally, to be very frank about it. And that was something which is a kind of global, leadership that probably, our generations do not know. So the book that you referred needs to be really, taught in the classes. And our students must know. I think that's the message I would request Dr. Agarwal. And let's bring that message to our classes in our economics, that what it means,
Will do, sir.
and how we have over a period of time lost that and come down to 3%, then 1%, and then lost completely our position. And of course 200 years of and in fact more than that, prior to that also. So all that, the kind of rulers, Britishers and others who have ruled us, and how we lost the way, and then how we are now thinking about or positioning ourselves to move in that direction. And I think, and that's not just one thing which you said. I think you said recognition of wealth creation as a boon, and that's something which is very clearly and with evidence you have brought out, that should not be viewed with a pinch of salt, but it should be welcome. I think since 1991 reforms and all that, on that has brought a lot of changes, of course, and you have cited many examples that how private investment also has helped in a growth process. Many examples you have given. I will not really repeat those, but how the government of India and your cited economic survey, your reports and all that, and in fact you sent to me and I also go through, though my own lack of background doesn't allow me to understand the whole thing, but at least understand part of it. And obviously the kind of growth that we are seeing now, and as you rightly said that we should be reaching 10% of global GDP by some years that you have said, by when India becomes 100 years of independence and celebrates it. So India at 100, more than 10% of global GDP, and that's the kind of target you have placed before India and everybody. And Honorable Prime Minister has given the call that India should be a $5 trillion economy. Leave aside the kind of timeline, but what is important in that is a paradigm shift in our thinking process, that doubling farmers' income and then becoming $5 trillion economy and so on and so forth. And that brings a change in our thinking process, a paradigm shift. And that is something which is very, very important. And that's how you start working in that direction. It might take a little more time, but certainly a movement, a kind of movement, a kind of revolutionary thought process is put in place. And of course, you said about the happiness, and and you rightly said that the wealth alone, whatever wealth is created, whether 60,000 US dollars per capita or whatever, even beyond that, obviously, unlimited wealth is not going to really give happiness. So initial basic requirements, I used to cite this, what famous J.B.S. Halden told that you require, what I require in life. That's what the kind of title of the chapter prose he wrote. And he said that I need only food, clothing, and shelter. That's my basic requirements. That's the fundamental requirements. And of course, there are items of comfort and then luxury. They are classified. That was 40, 50 years ago, but those definitions have changed. Of course, when you apply the principles of economics in today's, certainly, in today's world, there will be further redefinition of what I require in life. It cannot be just food, clothing, and shelter. So those items of luxury have become the essential items in life in many instances. So the happiness obviously depends on those basic needs. But India's philosophy, as you rightly said at the end, I fully agree that even the minimum requirements, in their absence, still people can be happy, and not necessarily, doesn't always correlate with the wealth that one has. Even it deviates from the fundamental principle of basic requirements for happiness. Because as you rightly said, it is within. And somebody said, a philosopher said that अभाव की बोध आपको दुख देता है, और वो अभाव की बोध को दूर करना आपका इंटरनल प्रोसेस है। वो प्रोसेस को अगर आप मैनेज कर सकते हैं तो सारे अवस्था के लिए अगर तैयार रहेंगे तो आपका दुख ही नहीं रहेगा, तो हैप्पीनेस ही होगा। तो ये एक फिलोसॉफिकल है, और इकोनॉमिक्स का प्रिंसिपल वहां अप्लाई नहीं करता हुआ, समथिंग एल्स अप्लाइज। And and that's the Indian philosophy. And I believe probably if in that context happiness is measured in India, probably we'll have to develop different index to measure that happiness. That maybe you can also do in your background and understanding of Vedantic philosophy. That what could be the measure that we can give to the world to measure happiness, not in terms of wealth and minimum requirements or whatever. And what could be, a different method to measure happiness. Exotic ideas of socialism and communism, which you talked about, that's another profound aspect of your talk today. And I believe that the inequality, in fact, the nature has inequality, and no one can eliminate inequality. Because by nature, we are differentially able. By nature, in our DNA it is, we are differentially able. And I can't be an economist like you, from IIT and all that. I can't go to IIT or send my children or everybody else. So everybody is not on the same platform and cannot be placed on the same platform. This is by nature. This is in DNA, that differentiation. So inequality would persist, but in terms of economic, empowerment, if we can, then the minimum that we work out, and that's what you said in terms of agriculture, the act and all that, that for the farmers, the income to increase, and then that requires private investment, and private investment requirement needs enabling laws, and enabling laws, unless they are worked out, obviously there will not be investment. Unless there is investment, there will not be wealth creation. Unless there is wealth creation, obviously the farmers cannot be empowered, their income cannot be increased, and that minimum basic requirement, whatever is required, obviously that cannot be met. And that has been the kind of situation in case of farming community in this country. But it is also true that agriculture contributes maximum to the poverty alleviation, and that in rural areas, and that is what that has been contributing, and it will continue to do so in quite some time, unless the off-farm income, income from outside sources contribute. So I'll not go into those details, but focusing on what you said, and certainly these farm laws are positive. And in fact, they would allow private investment. Once investment happens, suddenly it will lead to further growth in agriculture, and growth in agriculture certainly lead to more of demands and creation of demands, and demand creation and consumption, if it increases, and certainly that would attract further investment, and certainly it will create jobs, and it will create many other kind of situations, positives, and removing inequality and reducing poverty in agriculture sector. I think that's the message you have given in relation to the agriculture sector. And finally, what you said, and that's a kind of advice for us, suggestion to us, that how to increase productivity. In fact, yesterday we were discussing this issue of productivity, and there is going to be a kind of brainstorming session also shortly by the a organization called TAS, and Dr. R.S. Proda, our ex-secretary there, would be actually chairing that. So how do we increase productivity? Actually, this has been an issue because you can't compare productivity of Punjab with the productivity of Bihar or Odisha, or for that matter, other places. And there is so much of a diversity in this country, and socio-economic, and the kind of education, literacy, and so on and so forth, and infrastructure, and endowment with natural resources, and it's quite a bit of diversity. And addressing those requires quite a bit of investment, and you have rightly said, and that requires investment. And without investment, you can't remove those inequalities in what is existing, and that's the reason why we can't bring up our productivity. The potential yield, say, if I have to take the example of wheat, the potential yield is 8 tons per hectare. Punjab realizes 6 to 6.5 tons per hectare, but no other state is nearby. It's that's how the average comes down to 3.5 to 4 tons per hectare. And and that's the example for many things. And for the productivity of India is comparable to any other country in the world in case of wheat particular. So there are other things, and so that's the kind of but certainly investment and then enhancing productivity is key, as you rightly said, and we need to really focus on, and how do we actually address this, and and how more and more of technology can be actually leveraged to enhance productivity, and also in the process farmers' income, and create more wealth. And of course, private investment is very, very essential, but in sectors like agriculture, and public investment also is crucial, and that has been the case. And of course, our investment in welfare schemes, as you rightly said, whether it is PM Kisan and other things, and India has done a fantastic job in last 5, 6 years, 7 years, and that is how the welfare measures are being taken care. And there is also infrastructure funds which have been declared, and they are also hopefully will create kind of right kind of infrastructure for growth to happen in agriculture. But at the same time, technology enabling situation has to be actually created. And my only point to place before you is that investment, public investment, agriculture research needs consideration. And probably I would request you to actually look into it. And certainly we try for private investment. That has not really happened big scale. And also there are other issues which are regulatory issues, and that's inhibiting more of private investment. So that's a different issue. And but then public system has been a robust system, contributed to quite a bit of growth, and what you see in terms of food grains and all that. And we need to really look at it. It has remained constant for past 7 years almost. Leave aside salary, pension, and those things. So that needs really we may if you need, we can also discuss this another day. But anyway, so it was a fantastic lecture. We thoroughly enjoyed, and many take-home messages, and more philosophical, and that's something which we enjoyed thoroughly. And linking quite a bit of Indian philosophy with wealth creation, investment, and then eliminating inequality, and improving lives, and bringing happiness to the country. So that's something we thoroughly enjoyed. Thank you very much profusely for agreeing to our request and being part of this historic Azadi Ka Amrut Mahotsav celebration, as we do by our own department and then organization, Indian Council of Agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for nicely summarizing the talk and giving many more ideas additionally. So thank you once again, Dr. Subramanian, for this excellent talk. And we are so obliged.
In fact, the memento, the things and all that, the physicality is not there, so we are not able to felicitate you, but only felicitation in words, and that's all. So we'll seek some other occasion to have you physically. in time to come, so that we discuss and also have more interaction as we go along. So thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, sir.
Just one suggestion. You mentioned about, instead of giving Angus Madison's book, just the first chapter of the 2020 economic survey can be given to students to read. It captures all these ideas, in a very, very crisp manner. So,
okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll do that. So thanks to everybody whosoever has joined this program. So still 250 people are associated. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Namaskar. And
Thank
thanks
you.
to all the audience.